the drunken decree. The night began as a celebration, but history would remember it as a sentence, because in the great banquet hall of Persepolis, beneath towering columns and gold-inlaid ceilings, a single careless moment exposed how absolute power rots the soul. The air was thick with wine, and incense musicians played softly while nobles laughed too loudly, and at the center of it all sat King Xerxes, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known. A man worshipped in life like a god, feared in death like a curse, his word law, his silence terror. Yet that night his judgment was dulled by drink, and when an aging general, emboldened by wine and envy, asked for something no man should ever ask, the hall froze, because he did not request land, gold, or command. He requested the king's own daughter, still a child by law and custom, a living symbol of royal blood. And for a moment the empire waited, because everyone knew the truth that was never written down. A Persian king could never be seen to refuse in public. Refusal meant weakness, and weakness invited rebellion. So the pause-stretched torches flickered, musicians fell silent, and in that silence the girl understood something before anyone else did, that her life was being weighed against her father's pride. Her mother lowered her eyes. The women of the court stiffened, knowing that once spoken, royal words could never be taken back. And then it happened, not with rage or cruelty, but with something far worse, indifference, a single word uttered without emotion. Granted, applause followed out of terror, not joy, because clapping was safer than silence. And the general bowed, already victorious, while the girl stood unmoving, her body still hers, but her future gone. And this was the true violence of empire, not chains or blades, but the quiet moment when a human life is traded to preserve an image. Because in the Persian court, the king was not just a father, he was the state itself, and the state could not afford embarrassment. Ancient writers like Herodotus later hinted at these moments, describing banquets where decisions made in drunken pride were enforced soberly, the next day never reversed, because to reverse them would admit fallibility. And fallibility was forbidden. The palace was designed to hide such horrors, guarded by eunuchs loyal only to the throne, its corridors built to swallow screams, its records carefully cleaned, names removed, stories reduced to whispers. And so what began as a celebration became the opening act of a tragedy that would last years. Because this was not an accident. It was a system working exactly as intended. A world where a king's ego outweighed a daughter's existence, and where the most terrifying cruelty was delivered not with anger, but with calm authority, as the torches burned on and history quietly turned its face away. Born into a golden cage, she did not scream when the banquet ended. Because palace daughters were trained early, that sound could be dangerous. Instead, she walked back through endless marble corridors, lined with carved lions and winged gods. Her steps slow, her face still, while inside something was breaking quietly. This was the world she had been born into, a world of gold walls and soft carpets that hid a harder truth. That royal blood did not mean safety. It meant ownership from the moment she was born. Her life had never belonged to her. It belonged to the crown, to alliances, to appearances, to the fragile pride of men who ruled through fear. The Persian court was not a family. It was a machine. Every servant, guard, and noble existed to protect the image of King Xerxes, and anything that threatened the image was removed, quietly and completely. She had been raised by women who taught her obedience before reading, silence before laughter, and fear disguised as respect. She learned where she could walk, where she could not look, when to bow her head, when to disappear. Even as a child, she understood that love in the palace was conditional, even only when it served power. And now the condition had been broken, because one public promise had sealed her fate, and promises made by a king could not be undone without shaking the empire itself. Outside the palace walls, the world believed Persian princesses lived like goddesses, dressed in silk, guarded by armies. But inside those walls, she became a prisoner of ritual and expectation, watched by eunuchs who reported every movement, surrounded by women who had once been daughters themselves and knew exactly what awaited her, yet could do nothing. The nights grew longer, sleep became shallow, and every sound echoed too loudly, because the palace never truly slept. It listened. Ancient customs ruled everything. Customs older than Xerxes himself. Customs that treated royal women as political tools meant to bind loyalty and silence rivals. And to question them was unthinkable. Priests justified them as tradition. Nobles defended them as necessity, and history later recorded them as silence. Her mother wept only behind closed doors, because even grief could be seen as rebellion, and rebellion was punished without mercy. The girl was prepared, not with kindness, but with instruction. She was told what to wear, how to stand, how to endure. Endurance was praised as virtue, suffering as duty. And in this way, the palace reshaped her understanding of pain. It was not something to escape. It was something to survive quietly, day after day, while the empire celebrated its power and victories, never noticing the cost paid inside its own walls. And this was the cruel truth of absolute rule, that the greatest damage was done not on battlefields, but in rooms filled with gold, where a child learned that being born royal did not make her important. It made her expendable, and as preparations moved forward beyond her sight, she understood with growing clarity that the banquet had not been the end of her story. It had only been the beginning of a much darker chapter 1 the palace was determined to keep hidden. The ritual no one was meant to see what followed was never spoken of openly, because it existed in a shadowed space between law and tradition, a place where ritual was used to excuse cruelty, deep within the palace complex. Beyond the public halls and gardens, there were chambers few ever entered, rooms reserved for ceremonies that required silence rather than witnesses. This was where the court transformed personal suffering into political necessity, and where the girl was led under the guidance of priests and elder women whose faces showed no emotion, not because they were cruel, but because they had learned that emotion was dangerous. These rituals were ancient, older than the empire itself, born from a belief that royal blood could be offered to stabilize power, to reward loyalty, to prevent unrest, and they were wrapped in language that made them sound sacred rather than violent. Words like duty, destiny, and honor. The girl was dressed not as a bride, but as a symbol, layered in heavy garments meant to erase her individuality. Jewelry weighing down her neck like chains. Her hair arranged according to custom she did not understand. Torches lined the walls, their light flickering against stone carvings of kings and gods, watching in eternal judgment. And in those moments, she realized that no one was asking what she wanted, because desire had no place in ritual. Only obedience did. Outside these chambers, the empire slept, unaware that its stability was being purchased through silent sacrifice. The priests murmured invocations, not to comfort her, but to legitimize what was about to happen. Because rituals were powerful tools, they transformed violence into tradition and removed responsibility from the men who benefited most. Even the generals and nobles who supported such customs rarely witnessed them directly. Distance allowed denial, and denial preserved reputations. This was how systems of abuse survived for centuries, hidden behind incense smoke and sacred language. Ancient sources later hinted at such practices only indirectly. Greek writers spoke of Persian court customs with unease, noting how royal women vanished from records without explanation, how names were omitted as if they had never existed. Archaeology offers no screams, only empty rooms and sealed corridors. But absence itself tells a story. The girl understood that this ceremony was not about her future. It was about preserving an image of order, and once the ritual was complete, there would be no return to who she had been. Her identity would be rewritten by others, her role defined by silence. And the most terrifying realization came not from fear, but from clarity that this suffering was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was planned, justified, and protected by the highest powers in the empire, and as the final preparations were made beyond her sight, the palace closed in around her, once more, its walls swallowing another secret, because in this world, rituals were not meant to be remembered. They were meant to work. And what they worked toward was control, leaving her standing at the edge of a life she no longer recognized while history prepared to forget her entirely. 14 years of invisible torture. What came after the ritual was not sudden violence, but something far more devastating. Time itself became the weapon, because her punishment was designed to leave no marks that could be pointed to, no single moment that could be named as the crime. Instead, her life was stretched into a long corridor of controlled suffering, measured carefully so that nothing appeared openly cruel. She was moved away from the familiar sections of the palace into quieter quarters, beautiful in appearance yet isolating in purpose, rooms filled with fine fabrics and guarded doors where luxury existed, only to disguise captivity. This was how the Persian court perfected invisible torture, by ensuring that everything looked orderly, while the spirit slowly collapsed. Her days were ruled by schedules imposed by others. When to wake, when to eat, when to be seen, when to disappear. Conversations were monitored. Letters never reached their destination, and even silence was supervised. The eunuchs who guarded her were not monsters, but that made it worse, because they followed orders with mechanical obedience, never asking why, never acknowledging her pain. And in that indifference, she learned that suffering does not require hatred, only structure. Years passed in this suspended existence, each one erasing a little more of the girl she had been. Her laughter faded first, then her curiosity, then her sense of self. The court expected gratitude from her, gratitude for being spared public disgrace, gratitude for protection, gratitude for survival. And the expectation itself became another form of pressure, because to resist internally was dangerous. Despair had to be hidden just as carefully as rebellion. Outside her chambers, the empire marched, conquered, celebrated, and praised King Xerxes as a living god. Poets compared him to the sun. Inscriptions carved his victories into stone. But inside the palace, his daughter became a reminder of the cost of that divinity. She was allowed no voice, because voices create memory, and memory creates accountability. Ancient historians would later write extensively about battles, betrayals, and fallen cities, yet they would say nothing of these years, because psychological suffering leaves no ruins to excavate, no weapons to catalog, only a human being slowly hollowed out by control. Her body aged, her spirit endured, and endurance itself became the expectation, not survival, but obedience, until feeling nothing felt safer than feeling pain. And this was the true brilliance of the system. It did not need constant cruelty. It relied on routine, isolation, and the certainty that no one was coming to intervene, because intervention would require admitting that the king's public word had destroyed a private life, and that admission was more dangerous to the empire than any rebellion. And so the years continued, 14 of them, each one quieter than the last, until even her absence from history began to feel intentional, as if she were being erased not only from records, but from reality itself, leaving behind a living shadow whose suffering would never be written down, only hinted at through silence, while the palace remained calm, controlled and complicit, waiting for the moment when even her memory would no longer threaten the image of absolute power. Why history buried her name. When the years of her confinement finally passed beyond counting, something even more deliberate began to happen. Her existence was quietly removed from the story the empire told about itself, because empires do not only rule through armies, they rule through memory, and memory can be edited. Names were never carved for her. No inscriptions marked her passage through life, and court records that should have mentioned her simply moved from one subject to the next, as if a royal daughter had never stood beneath those golden ceilings. This was not an accident of time. It was policy. Persian power depended on the illusion of harmony within the royal house. A king who could not protect his own blood threatened the image of divine authority. So scribes learned what not to write, poets learned which stories not to sing, and priests learned which truths were better left unspoken. Even foreign historians struggled to grasp what had happened. Greek writers like Herodotus hinted at dark customs in the Persian court, moments where women vanished from public life without explanation. But hints were all that survived. because those who knew the full truth were either loyal, afraid, or already gone. Archaeology gives us palaces and corridors, seals and reliefs, but it gives us no testimony of suffering. Only absence, and absence itself becomes evidence. The silence around her is louder than any accusation. It reveals a system skilled not only in control, but in erasure. And this erasure served a purpose by removing her story. The empire preserved the myth that royal decisions were wise, necessary and unquestionable, that sacrifices were noble rather than cruel, and that personal loss was a small price for stability. Over time, even those within the palace began to forget details, because forgetting was safer than remembering. Memory carried risk, and risk invited punishment. Generations past, empires fell, new rulers claimed the same stones, and still her name did not return. Because history often protects power long after power is gone, scholars today debate fragments, analyzing what was written and what was not, noticing the sudden gaps, the unexplained silences surrounding royal women. And slowly a different picture emerges, one where greatness is built not only on conquest, but on concealed suffering. Her story was buried because it contradicted everything the empire wanted to represent. It showed that absolute authority corrodes intimacy, that public strength demands private cruelty, and that the most devastating violence is often the kind that leaves no trace. By the time ruins replaced palaces, her life had already been reduced to a void in the record, a deliberate forgetting that worked exactly as intended, and yet that very absence now raises uncomfortable questions. Because what history chooses not to say often reveals more than what it proudly records. And in that silence, her story waits, unfinished, challenging the image of glory that still clings to the name of a king, and forcing us to confront the possibility that some of the darkest truths of the ancient world were not lost, they were hidden. The price of absolute power. When the empire that once seemed eternal finally began to fracture, it did so without acknowledging the quiet lives it had consumed. Because collapse does not return what power has taken, it only exposes the cost. Long after the palace fell silent and the torches were extinguished, scholars began to notice the patterns that earlier generations ignored. The sudden disappearances of royal women from records, the careful way ancient writers circled around certain events without naming them, the gaps where personal stories should have been, and slowly a darker understanding emerged that the greatness of the Persian Empire was built not only on armies and administration, but on an internal culture where obedience mattered more than humanity, where a king's image outweighed the lives of those closest to him. The fate of the daughter was not an exception. It was a warning, a demonstration of what happens when authority becomes untouchable. Because absolute power does not need cruelty to announce itself, it only needs silence. And silence was the empire's greatest weapon. It allowed men to sleep at night, knowing that what they had ordered would never be spoken of again. It allowed future generations to admire monuments without asking who paid the unseen price. And it allowed history itself to become complicit. By repeating victories while omitting victims, the girl's life ended not with a recorded death, but with something worse, total disappearance. A fate that denied even remembrance. And this is why her story matters now, not because it is unique, but because it is familiar, echoed in countless forgotten lives across centuries. Whenever power justified itself through tradition, whenever suffering was renamed duty, and whenever those with voices chose not to use them. The final truth uncovered by modern historians is not found in a single document or ruin, but in the pattern itself, that empires are skilled at hiding their most shameful acts behind ceremony and silence, and that greatness measured only by conquest is always incomplete. In the end, the most enduring legacy of Xerxes was not the size of his realm, but the lesson his reign leaves behind, that when a ruler values pride over people, even family becomes expendable, and humanity is the first casualty. As we look back across the ruins and texts, her absence forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. How many stories like hers remain buried? Not because they were insignificant, but because they were too revealing. And perhaps the darkest reflection of all is this, that history does not forget these stories by accident. forgets them because forgetting makes power easier to admire, and remembering makes it impossible to ignore the cost.